runtime has no concept of read-only references. There's no way to transition from an API that was exposed before and existed, and therefore we had to use ref to one after, where ref read-only is more appropriate, which has also presented problems for us in the past, and where we've just gone with ref for consistency. So I think my overall vote here is that because this is namely a Power API, particularly because it uses ref, we should put it on like Memory Marshal or similar under interop services, where the other similar APIs are. And Power users will already likely be referencing that namespace to get the other types. And then we should likely sit down with the language team and determine the right way to move forward with the other problematic cases, especially cases like this one.
So Jen, you're proposing not only putting it there, but also changing the input to be ref?
No, keeping it as in.
I guess
But because it's in the interop services namespace, it's not going to be something that people who are referencing system will see by default. And so they won't see this by default
anyway. I mean, you'd have to type nullable dot, which is a pretty rare thing to do.
Is it not an extension method still? I thought it was as proposed. Oh, okay. Never mind then.
What are the guarantees the compiler makes on stack space regarding transient variables? In particular, if you did get a local copy because it's a R value, is the ref pointing to something that might be overwritten, in which case we shouldn't ship this at all? Or is there something in here guaranteeing that even though that's an unnamed local variable, that space will persist until the end of the function? And then what happens if you return it?
I don't think you get to return it.
I think if you ref return, you can return it, and now you've returned stack space that's no longer active.
Yeah, I think the compiler doesn't let you do that.
I'm pretty sure. Yeah, so I'm pretty sure that because the helper itself returns a byref, the compiler will ensure that any address passed into it will be legal through the end of its own frame. I'm pretty sure that it won't overwrite that because, again, the helper is returning a byref. Someone else can correct me if my understanding's mistaken.
And the language won't let you do this wrong.
Okay, yeah. That's good. So yeah, as far as we do the official guideline, official being what got sent out to the DL, no one objected too strenuously, made it through Steve's review, and then made it into the book, is don't use in. But as with all things, it's if you're reading this book and trying to understand why we have the guidance, you don't understand how to use it. If you're in this meeting and you're arguing that in is the right answer, you might know how to use it.
They're also guidelines, not rules.
Right.
There are always exceptions to guidelines.
Yeah, and so it's in public API, you're starting at minus, it's minus 1,000 for a new member, and you're at minus 10,000 if you think it should use in, but you can argue it back up to plus. In this case, it's probably reasonable. It's just, the concerns of when you're getting copies and is that going to do what you want, then the concern that I had of are we actually introducing stack violation bugs in here, but as long as the compiler promises not to make it a stack violation bug, I have less care.
Yeah, I just ran a sample application and it looks like there's no violation here.
It fails to compile because you're returning a ref that can't be or won't outlive its return?
No, as in if you call the helper twice in the same method, the R value that's passed in, there actually is two separate stack spaces for each R value that's passed in. And if the outermost method returns the value by ref, then its own input to the helper must have itself been a byref that was passed into the outermost method, or something whose address survives.
Yeah, otherwise you get the error, cannot use a blah, blah, blah in this context because it might expose variables referenced by blah, blah, blah. So, I mean, that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not a
Basically,
thing
the
I do
compiler
often
errs
enough
on
that I
side
know
of caution.
the error condition, so I have to ask questions.
The compiler errs on the side of caution and marks each ref as this ref might potentially be referencing a local address, and if that's the case, you can't return that ref from the method.
The same as the stack expand.
Yeah,
investigator.
Exactly. Because the compiler, like we know for a fact that the compiler is maybe a little bit overly zealous with these checks, but it does a pretty good job of preventing you from shooting your foot off.
Fair enough.
And I assume if you were to make this method in a regular instance method nullable, it wouldn't solve the in problem, right?
Right, because nullable of t is a struct, and until we get the language support, which actually should be coming in .NET 7 unless something goes wrong for ref this returns, then you can't actually do that in C#. But if we do get that, then having this as a property called like value ref or default ref would actually be legal, and we just annotate that with ref this escapes attribute.
So what's the conclusion then? We don't want this API, or we want this API but only under certain conditions?
I think we want the API. It's something that would be beneficial in a number of contexts, especially performance-oriented scenarios. I think the issue is there's not a solid decision on how we should expose it and how it's impacted by the L value R value thing. I still think the cleanest thing here would be to keep in, because that's correct and solves a number of cases, but also potentially just moving it out of system. Given it's not an extension method, though, I think it being unnullable is still fine. But not everyone here agrees.
So what are the issues then? So the only thing I heard was that if you call this method as it's spec'd right now, the downside is that the compiler might have made a copy, so the ref you're getting back might not be the ref to the original thing. Are there any other
Correct.
problems?
That's the only issue.
Right.
And it matters less because it's not a writable ref, so you don't have the, well, I wrote back to it and it works sometimes, but not all the time problem.
Yeah, but if you're accessing it by ref, it means one of two things. You were either doing it to avoid copies in the first place, or you were doing it because you wanted to observe changes to the value. And both of those scenarios are now broken. If a copy
I guess. Made. Well, yeah. So it's if a local copy gets made, you went out of your way to write code to do something faster and avoiding the copy, but it made the copy anyway. So you have more complicated code than you need for the same perf.
Yeah. So okay, so I think I would agree with Tanner's proposal then. Like, keep the API because it's useful. Keep it in because that is a correct semantic. Maybe we move it somewhere where people are less likely to run into it. I think Steve argued that being on the nullable type made it hard to get at anyway.
I think being a non-extension static hanging off of nullable is out of the way enough.
Yeah, I think I'd agree. What I would like to do, however, is to, like, we should set up that meeting with Jared and the language team to make sure that our concerns with using in are relayed, and what problems we keep hitting in API review to ensure that we can come to an agreement on whether that's some new warning wave in the compiler, an analyzer that enforces usage of in for particular APIs, or some other fix, so we don't continue having this discussion every time a power API that where in is correct comes up.
Okay.
So I pasted in some notes. So one thing with the analyzer that we said we are scared to write an analyzer because we don't think we can get all the semantics right. But one compromise could be that we say, hey, we only check for patterns that we know are safe, or patterns that we know will not result in copies, and warn on everything else. I mean, that might be overly aggressive, but that might be okay.
Or the inverse, where we warn on things that we know are not going to do what you want to do. You're passing a non-ref property as the argument. We warn. It's never going to be what you want.
I think the right thing for an analyzer here is, particularly given that we believe that the number one use case for this is avoiding copies. And the only way to guarantee the compiler never copies is to explicitly specify in at the usage site, is that an analyzer should just go and say, you're not using in, and this method expects in. So declare it, and then the compiler will implicitly enforce that no copies happen, because declaring in makes it no longer allow the L value case.
Sorry, I missed the part of in. I mean, that's not the current behavior of in, right? The compiler will make the silent copy if the thing is not an R value.
So the call site, something that takes in, can either be foo or in space foo. And if you do in space foo can't be an R value.
In on the call site, yeah.
Right. So Tanner's suggesting the analyzer for this method and any others we were concerned about would basically force you to write in if you didn't.
Gotcha.
And then someone can, of course, ignore or pragma it out, but it ultimately ends up giving the function of you cannot pass something that would be implicitly copied. You either have to explicitly make that copy yourself and then pass the into that copy, or use something that is non-copying because it's already
I have to say,
a ref.
I understand where you're coming from and why you're suggesting that path. I always get very squeamish at the idea of writing analyzers that tell you not to do things the language explicitly was designed to let you do. Which is why there were lots and lots of discussions and very clear decisions made about not requiring in at the call site. And so to then add an analyzer that says, but you must add in at the call site, I think kind of goes against that.
But I'm not saying do it globally, but rather potentially alongside an attribute or explicit recognition of methods that says, oh, this is get value ref or default ref, and we know that the copy semantics are problematic here, and that this API is designed to be used to avoid copies.
I mean, to a certain extent, I agree with what Stephen is saying, but you could reasonably argue that this is a code style thing, right? In the same way that people decide to ban var in their code base, they could decide that if an API is marked as in, you want the call style to be also in to avoid cases where you accidentally make copies, right?
Yeah, it might be, like, it would be good when talking to the language team to talk about and ask them why they allowed specifying in, because there's some reason that the LDM decided explicitly writing in was a good option to have instead of it always being implicit.
Let me rephrase
the scenario they're thinking of.
Yeah, let me rephrase what I was saying is, if Jared and Mads decided that there should be a compiler warning, or if the C# team decided there should be an IDE code style analysis to make this configurable, that's a perfectly reasonable thing for them to decide to do as the owners of the language. I don't believe it is our place in this meeting to decide we're going to add such an analyzer globally, that to enforce code style or whatever. If we really think it's impactful to this specific API and we wanted to add an API for this specific API, that's something we could choose to do. I still think we would be in a better position if we just had if we really think it's an issue. And first, I think we should probably wait until we actually see that it's an issue. But if we think it's actually an issue, I would rather see us just warn on the things that we know to be problematic. And we can probably detect with a very, very, very negligible false positive rate things that we know are a problem, even if it allows through some small number of false negatives.
Right. And just to clarify in my case, I wasn't suggesting we add an analyzer that globally says you're not using in, you should use it. I'm saying for for APIs like nullable get value ref or default ref, or cases like unsafe.asref in T, we should likely explicitly go and mark those ones as an in is expected here because of what this function is doing. And so it's specifically for the cases of using an R value is problematic. And so it's not global. It's rather some an analyzer for specific APIs, both at the BCL and potentially even community level, to say using in is effectively required here, or you're going to be putting yourself into potentially problematic cases. But I also think talking to the language first is a good idea, and trying to get on the same page of what the problem we have with these implicit copies is and how we might address that. So that we have a path forward, potentially without needing an analyzer.
So then, is the conclusion more or less we will approve the API, but then we should have the conversation in parallel? Because I don't think we want to block on the analyzer, right? That's the vibe I'm hearing.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to say.
Is the thing I put in the bullet point a fair summary of our discussion?
Yeah, I think that sums up what I was saying.
Before you click the comment button, we unusually didn't have any discussion about the naming. I'm surprised people are actually okay with the name I wrote.
Yeah, I checked earlier, like ref seems to be our standard convention for things where we take something and give you back a ref. I think extending this to get value default seems reasonable to me.
Yeah. And we already have get value ref or null ref. So this follows the pattern, just using default ref. The interesting thing the only other name I could think of that would work here is get value or default ref, but that's potentially ambiguous in some cases, just reading the API name.
It's either the value or a ref to default.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
so I think value ref or default ref is explanatory enough and matches the existing convention, even if it's not the best name.
For what it's worth, that's how I ended up with that name as well. I don't like it, but it seemed like the best one given all the constraints.
Yep.
100%.
What is the F# or even VB experience with ref read-only parameters, aka in?
That's a great question to which I do not have an answer, but I think the way I understand this feature is that it will not give you access to something you can't have, right? It's just giving you a more performant version of that, and that's generally what we would
No,
accept
but like
a...
we have the C# sample. Yes, we generally work in C#, but it's the nullable.getValue ref or default ref of some field or local or whatever. What's the sample look like in F#? Does using in versus ref complicate F#? Are refs already problematic in F#? I don't use it, so I don't know.
I mean, let me ask you a different question. Let's say the answer is yes, it does. What would you do differently?
Well, if passing an in is complicated in F#, but we think that it's a valuable scenario there as well, then we might want to hold approving this, hoping that we can get the other thing, the instance method or property that just returns the ref. Then you don't have the argument passing as an explicit syntax, and so it's Like, is the usability of this so bad in F# that we would want to wait for a different approach, given that we think it would happen in the same release? Or is it good enough that this is fine?
Yeah, F# explicitly has inrefs now.
Okay.
I mean, basically, you would be saying, like, instead of having an API that takes in, we would make it an instance method on nullable of T.
Well, that was the thing that was discussed, but that the current version of the C# language specification does not allow that, and for some reason, and that that once it could, then we could have a different shape for this.
I mean, then it basically comes down to, like, would we be okay with that being an instance method, right? I think part of the reason why we would put it as a static helper is to kind of make it less discoverable, which seems like a reasonable thing. It's not something that you want people to use all over the place, right?
That's fair.
That's why I was asking, like, what the alternative is, right? Because I'm totally fine with saying these kind of APIs, if they don't work in some language, it's fine. It just means you don't get the perf. You can still do it. You just don't get it as fast.
That's right. And it looks like they just have ampersand, according to the doc link that Eric just shared. So yeah.
Okay, then.
It's just one of those. We've just making sure we considered other languages.
We do consider them. It doesn't mean that we care.
I asked the question. That means
Yeah,
we've
no.
not considered it.
All right, so let me click comment. And then what I heard is that we click on approve as well. If only I could spell. All right. Jeremy, are you still with us?
Yes. So this proposal is for the source generated DLL import trigger attribute, basically. So as part of the DLL import generator, we are introducing a new attribute for people to put on their partial static methods that we will then generate a stub that calls a DLL import and has all of the marshalling code inside of the stub. Part of this attribute is that we have dropped basically all of the legacy features from DLL import. All the Windows only features from DLL import have also been dropped. So we're only having basically cross-platform style properties on the attribute. So it takes the library name as a parameter of the constructor, same as DLL import. Then you can specify entry point, how you want to marshal string parameters, and I don't remember what else we put on there. Because I don't. Can you scroll the proposal down a little bit? Yes, and then set left error support, since that needs to be in the stub for some reliability cases. And then the Marshall strings using property ties into the next proposal, which was how we're going to support custom user type marshalling in the source generated interop system.
Is that this one
And
here?
along with this attribute, there's going to be some analyzers to help ensure correct usage.
Yeah. So
Yeah, that one.
let me try to understand. So are you more or less proposing that a library import attribute would effectively replace DLL import for most code? Is that the direction?
Yes. The goal is that it will replace DLL import for the majority of code. There are some types that we do not support with library import, and we will tell you that. And you'll go back to the previous system. Library import for the custom user type marshalling, as explained in the other proposal, ties in with the disable runtime marshalling attribute that we added. So the idea is people will generally switch over an assembly at a time because we provide a code fix to help convert from DLL import to library import.
Jeremy, by the time we ship .NET 7, will .NET runtime itself have any remaining use of DLL import?
From the basic looks of it now, I don't believe so. We may have some usages still in the tests, Right now, I'm working around some cases where there's another proposal that's in the pipeline that I think we can probably get for .NET 7. That as I work on migrating stuff to use disable runtime marshalling, I'm seeing more and more use cases for handling another interop case in .NET 7, so we can make sure we aren't using DLL import anymore. There are a few cases, particularly like safe handle marshalling and safe handles of special types of variants, that's a little more complex, but those are things we should still be able to handle.
What's the answer for anything doing a p-invoke out of a net standard 2 or netfx compiled library? Is this duck typed, or is this we have to expose these downref, or they just don't work in those scenarios? You said we would be complete, so I'm trying to understand complete.
Yeah. So it's complete for .NET 7. For anyone targeting down level, we are not going to officially support down level scenarios. This attribute will be injected by the generator, and if you set up a way to use the generator down level, then we have a form of compat that we use in .NET Runtime repo, which is basically does as much as it can in the stub, and then falls back to DLL import for anything that can't be handled with the APIs available at that level.
That seems reasonable.
So what is the expected impact of these attributes on a per method basis for something like, let's say CS132 or my own TerraFX, where you potentially have thousands of DLL imports? Is that going to impact type loading? Is it going to be problematic that these, unlike the native DLL import attribute, aren't pseudo attributes? They're actual user custom attributes, and there's potentially a lot of replicated data where potentially the entry point is implicitly from the method name, but the library name is shared between every single method.
So my understanding would be this attribute would be trimmable, so you could trim it out. The runtime does not use this attribute at all. Inside the stub, we have a local p-invoke that will actually do the call. So for cases where it's like TerraFX and there'd be a lot of generated code, the extra attributes would not do anything at runtime. Additionally, courtesy of a suggestion from Stephen, we have everything configured such that if every single parameter is blittable, or if all the parameters are blittable or in the down level scenario not handled, then we just omit the partial definition of the library import method as a DLL import, because there is no work for the stub to do. So we have one less function jump in those cases.
Right, but it will inflate IL size, right?
Yes, IL size does increase when using the source generator.
Well, I guess the source generator runs in the library as well.
Yeah, I mean, by definition, you're doing at compile time what would normally be done at runtime. So effectively all the code that the runtime was emitting at runtime for all the stubs instead is generated at compile time in IL. So
yep.
Anything that does require marshaling, or any that can't just be a non-marshal DLL import, will have an additional set of methods injected with IL to do the marshaling for you in the compiled assembly.
Yeah, so in other words, you already increase the IL size anyway, so doing it for the custom attribute table is probably, a drop in the bucket by comparison.
Yeah.
I mean, the nice thing is, unless you specify the entry point, probably most of the data is identical, in which case the blob, I think, is reused between different attributes. You just have the blob would be the same, but you of course have one rule per CA application, but it's probably not that big.
Yeah, and I don't know if Jeremy at all have done any investigation of libraries that have thousands upon thousands of DLL imports and are only effectively DLL imports, but they have done analysis of .NET Runtime where we make pretty darn heavy use of it And to my knowledge, there hasn't been any perceivably impactful increase, even in IL size, compared to all the other IL we have.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, we were under 1 megabyte increase when we were in a scenario where we could compare a runtime not using generated DLL import and a runtime using it, or the old name. Yeah, so basically comparing one thing using the generator and an exact same build not using the generator, we saw a 1 megabyte difference. Since merging it in and we looked at the size increase, the size decreases the team worked on throughout .NET 6 and the start of .NET 7 have already completely made up the size increase that we saw.
Has WinForms looked into this?
Has what?
WinForms.
Sorry?
WinForms, have they looked
WinForms.
into using it?
Yeah.
I am watching it closely.
Because I mean, I think they have like thousands of p invokes probably, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we're.
I
I
think
as soon as this becomes public, I intend to do a test of it. The presumption is that it'll have a significant impact on our startup time. Because
A positive impact, Jeremy.
Huh?
A beneficial impact. Yeah.
Yes, a beneficial impact. Yes,
Okay,
right.
that sounds better.
So, yeah. Sometimes what comes out of my mouth doesn't match what's going on in my brain. So, yeah, I'm hopeful for it, and currently my plan of record is to actually do it. But of course, I need to run through and change things. We've already made all of our existing ones blittable, or most of them. So it's a pretty quick run through to do it. But we're anxiously looking forward to this for .NET 7.
And I know one of the community members who contributes to WinForms as well is strongly looking forward to this coming out, so you can use it in WinForms.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, Mr. Korazinski, thank you, Jeremy. So you said the generator will inject this attribute, but how would the generator know to what are you writing on your declaration if this attribute's injected? Is it simply referencing the generator package will inject the generator, or sorry, will inject the attribute?
So the current thinking from the team is that, so first of all, it'll be injected as part, the source gen, Roslyn supports a mechanism for injecting source as part of a generator before the generator sees it. So it'll show up in IntelliSense, so you can type it out, but it won't actually, the source file for this attribute will not actually live in .NET runtime as a source file compiled into a ref assembly. It'll show up.
Okay, so referencing the generator at all will inject this attribute if it's not part of your TFM, and and so you always write the word library import. It's not itself triggered by having seen a word somewhere. So
no.
Okay. Thank you. That was just hanging on in the back of my head, and I was wondering how that worked.
Yeah, and for shipping the generator, we're thinking shipping as part of the TFM and as a separate package, so people can, if they want to, consume a different version than the runtime supports, but we can figure that out later.
Okay.
So back to the actual API, Jeremy. So for example, Marshall strings using completely replaces char set, and there's no opportunity to go back to the old style. You're basically forced to write the new thing. Do you have examples for maybe lower in the issue for what some existing DLL imports look like instead with library import where you are required to make changes?
So we don't have changes for Marshall strings using yet, as we haven't updated the generator to actually have this in its implementation. Part of the plan is to create marshallers that match that fit the model that can be used in Marshall strings using, so that as part of the code fix we can auto convert, and we basically convert it to a Unicode string marshaller or a UTF-8 string marshaller sort of thing, or a platform string marshaller. We don't currently have examples of that, as we haven't had a chance to write it out. I can throw together some examples and share. I just don't know where you would like me to share it, or Eleanor can. If I see she's sent some messages in the chat.
So that the Marshall strings using came out of a issue that we had of trying to sort all that out, and so that issue has should have some code examples of how we're expecting it to be used and ways we want to make it easier for people to use.
Wow, so
regarding that,
instead of writing char set equals char set.utf8, I write Marshall strings using equals typo system.runtime.interop services.encoding.utf8 string marshalling.
You can use the using import and reduce those words, Steve.
Yeah.
So
given you'll probably already have it using for system runtime interop services, that takes off at least some of it.
Okay.
I think what Steve's kind of hinting at is one of the things I was going to comment on, which is like clearly string marshalling is important enough that you promoted it as a first-class citizen on this attribute itself, rather than requiring each individual parameter to be attributed. But if you're promoting it to be on the attribute, why not promote the simple thing, like charset.utf8, charset.utf16, charset.utf32?
Sure.
Like that seems like it would direct people toward the easier thing.
Eleanor, do you want to take this, or do you want me to take it?
The char set we were trying to move away from just because of how confusing the support for that would be. If we add to it and we don't have, we'd have inconsistent support across the built-in.
Only if you chose not to implement it in the built-in.
Yes,
Yeah,
which
so
we very much
I'm
don't
not,
want to do.
I don't think you should use the existing char set type, because it also includes things like ANSI and auto, which don't really make sense. But if you had a separate enum, which was just like, this can go by default as one of three things: 8, 16, 32, the end. And if you want something custom, then put a Marshall as attribute on the actual parameter itself. How is that not easier than the proposal here?
The idea instead of adding a new enum, the idea with the proposal was to match the rest of the new system, where we use the same mechanism for saying marshal all strings using this marshaller, as we say on each parameter, marshal a string using this marshaller. Because we already have that defined right now in DLL import, where it's two completely separate mechanisms for specifying. So one of the ideas was to unify the design. So you use the same mechanism no matter where you're specifying it to say how you want to marshal strings.
Yes, but the fact that you brought it onto the attribute as a first-class citizen makes me think that you had intended to make the scenario easier for people to specify, correct?
Yes.
Yes, we intended to make it easier for these cases of like where someone has 4 string parameters, because that's just a lot of extra attributes if we can bring that up.
Yeah,
right. And what I was getting at, I guess, is like, if you're going to make it easier, why not just make it easiest and say, if you're mixing and matching, just fall back to doing custom attributes on each parameter, saying Marshall using this particular marshaller.
I think it'd be worth exploring what this actually feels like in IntelliSense when you kind of have the design you want. If you think about char set, like if I type char set equals today in VS, it pops up char set, I hit dot, and I get a list of everything that I can do. That's not going to be the case with how you have this defined. I'm going to say Marshall strings using equals, and I'm going to be left with crickets. And then I'm going to have to type of, and I'm going to have to figure out all the possible things out of all possible types in the world that are valid. And maybe I get lucky and I type Marshall, and IntelliSense narrows it down to 50 things. And then I can figure out which of those are marshallers that are valid. But I think what you'll find, and I could be wrong, but I think what you'll find is the usability of this, even though from a readability perspective, it might be fine. From a writability perspective, I think you're going to find it's problematic.
Yeah, I agree. I think from a usability perspective, we should support the enum here and the type, so that if you want something that the enum can't express, you can do that. It's more work in the generator because it needs to failure compile if you've overspecified, but or if there are enum members that it just can't support. But I think allowing the default cases to say, here's a menu, pick from the menu, instead of basically write in an answer and hope that it's legal, feels better.
I think that's fair. We could
Yeah,
we could also continue doing the. You might be able to inject our own enum type thing the same way we're doing for the attribute itself, since I don't want to re-overload the existing chars at enum. Then you should still get the IntelliSense experience, I believe.
Yeah, a second enum would be, but it's using an enum for the, the 98% case seems way friendlier.
And as
I think just having a new
as a
enum
complete
seems
bit,
reasonable.
yeah, as a complete
So-
bit, just because it's on the screen and it's been bothering me, presumably on the existing thing that you have to declare that it should actually be typed ?
Yes.
Itch scratched. Thanks.
I have a more general question. Like, so we in the past discussed adding more attributes because we couldn't add properties to DLL import. Are there any cases where these new configurations have to be supported both for library import attribute as well as DLL import attribute?
No. Everything here we can translate down to what exists on DLL import attribute. And anything we add in the future will exist within the marshaller itself. Or within the marshalling stub itself. So we don't need to add anything new to DLL import attribute.
To piggyback on what Emo just asked, do you support things like default DLL import search paths attribute?
We internally, the internal call is actually just the DLL import, so yes, we support that.
So you would forward all other custom attributes that are applied to the method that is marked with library import attribute?
We forward any attributes so the generator forwards attributes that it knows affect a DLL import down to the DLL import. So like